Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. It was October 2015. I had just turned 16 and was excited about my first job as a babysitter. I lived in a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, and had been taking care of the Thompson family's children for a few weeks. That Halloween, the parents had to travel for work and asked me to take Tommy, 7, and Lily, 5, trick or treating. I loved those kids and thought it would be fun, you know. Little did I know that night would change my life forever. The day started normally. I went to school, came home, and got ready to go to the Thompsons. I arrived there around p.m. The kids were already in costume and super excited. Tommy was a little Iron Man with a cardboard armor he had made himself, and Lily was dressed as Elsa from Frozen with a sparkly blue dress. I put on a purple wig and some cat ears, nothing too elaborate. We went out as soon as it got dark. Around 6:30 p.m., the neighborhood was all decorated with lit pumpkins on porches and fake spider webs in the trees. There were many other kids on the street, all dressed up and excited. The air was cold and damp, typical of autumn in Ohio, and I could see my breath forming a mist in the air. We started walking around the neighborhood, the kids running from house to house shouting trick or treat. I followed them closely, always alert. It was when we reached a corner that I first saw the maintenance guy. He was changing a light bulb on a lamppost, wearing a faded blue jumpsuit with the name Mike embroidered on the chest. What caught my attention was the way he looked at us. It wasn't a normal look, you know. It was as if he knew us, as if he had been waiting for us. He came down from the ladder and walked towards us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hi, guys. Cool costumes," he said, crouching down to the children's height. Tommy and Lily smiled shyly, but I felt a shiver down my spine. Mike stood up and addressed me. "You must be the Thompsons' new babysitter, right? I live in the apartment complex nearby and do maintenance around here. It's quite a night for trick or treating, huh?" He spoke casually, but there was something in his tone that bothered me. How did he know I was a babysitter? Why was he so interested in us? I could only nod, feeling my heart race. "Look," he continued, "if you want, I can accompany you. You know, to make sure everything stays safe. I know all the best places to trick or treat around here." At that moment, I didn't know whether to be relieved to have an adult around or terrified by a stranger's unexpected offer. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing to decide what to do. On one hand, Mike seemed to be just a helpful neighborhood guy. On the other, something about him made me uneasy. Before I could answer, Tommy pulled my sleeve and said, "Come on, Sarah. I want to go to that house with the flashing lights." I looked at his and Lily's excited faces and decided I didn't want to ruin their night with my worries. "All right," I replied to Mike, trying to sound confident. "You can come with us." His smile widened in a way that made me swallow hard. We continued our walk, now with Mike accompanying us. He walked a little behind me and the kids, always attentive. Every now and then, he would make comments about the houses or people passing by. "Ah, that's the Johnson's house. Mr. Johnson always gives out giant chocolate bars." Or, "Watch out for that dog. It sometimes escapes through the gate." What scared me was how he knew so many details about everything and everyone. At one point, he even mentioned that Tommy was allergic to peanuts. How could he know that? I had never seen this man before in my life, but he seemed to know everything about us. My skin started to tingle, that feeling that something was very, very wrong. But I couldn't just grab the kids and run away, could I? What if I was overreacting? After all, he hadn't done anything concrete to scare me. Still, I couldn't shake that growing feeling of fear in my stomach. As the night went on, Mike's behavior became increasingly strange. He started suggesting specific streets for us to go, always insisting he knew better shortcuts. "Let's go this way," he'd say, pointing to a poorly lit street. "There are some great houses down there." I tried to resist, saying I preferred to stay on the main streets, but he always had an excuse. "Oh, but there are fewer people there. The kids will get more candy." The worst part was that Tommy and Lily seemed to like him, laughing at the silly jokes he made. I felt trapped, as if I was being subtly guided somewhere, but I couldn't understand where or why. On one of these darker streets, Mike offered to take the children to a house while I rested a bit. "You look tired, Sarah," he said, using my name for the first time, which made me freeze. I had never introduced myself to him. "I'll take them to that house over there and be right back." My heart raced. There was no chance I was going to leave the children alone with him. "No, it's okay," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll go with them." Mike shrugged, but I saw something pass through his eyes. Frustration? Anger? It was so quick I wasn't sure. As we walked to the house, I realized we were alone on that street. There were no other children, no adults. The houses all seemed dark and silent. The only sound was the rustling of dry leaves under our feet and my own rapid breathing. We arrived at the house Mike had indicated. It was an old building with peeling paint and windows covered by boards. It didn't look like the kind of place that would be handing out candy on Halloween. "Are you sure someone's home?" I asked, my voice trembling a little. Mike smiled in a way that made my stomach churn. "Of course, there is. This is Mrs. Peterson's house. She loves children." He leaned towards Tommy and Lily, whispering as if telling a secret. "They say she has the best candy in the neighborhood." The kids, excited by the idea, ran to the door before I could stop them. When I reached the porch, Mike was already there, standing right behind them. Lily knocked on the door, shouting trick or treat. In her excited little voice, nothing happened. She knocked again. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of dry leaves being blown by the wind. It was then that I noticed something strange. There was no light coming from inside the house, not even the faint glow of a TV or lamp. It was as if the house was completely empty. "I think we'd better leave," I said, trying to stay calm. But when I turned to leave, Mike was blocking the way. His smile had disappeared, replaced by an expression that made my blood run cold. "But why the hurry, Sarah?" he asked, his voice now low and threatening. "The night has just begun." At that moment, I knew I had made a terrible mistake in trusting him. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Instinctively, I pulled Tommy and Lily close to me, putting myself between them and Mike. "Kids," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "let's go home now, okay?" But Mike took a step forward, still blocking our exit. "Don't you want to see what's inside the house?" he asked, his voice now completely different, cold and threatening. It was at that moment that I heard a noise coming from inside the house, a creaking of wood, as if someone was moving in there. Mike smiled, but it was no longer the fake smile from before. It was something predatory, scary. I knew I had to act fast. While Mike was looking at the door, waiting for it to open, I bent down and whispered in the children's ears, "When I say, now, run as fast as you can back to the main street. Don't stop for anything, understood?" Tommy and Lily, finally realizing something was wrong, nodded with eyes wide with fear. I took a deep breath, gathering all the courage I had. At the exact moment, the doorknob began to turn. I shouted, "Now," and pushed Mike with all the strength I could muster. He stumbled backward, surprised, and in that moment of confusion, the three of us jumped off the porch and started running as if our lives depended on it, and they probably did. We ran like we had never run before. My lungs were burning. My heart felt like it was going to explode, but I didn't dare look back. I held Tommy and Lily's hands tightly, practically dragging them with me. I could hear Mike's heavy footsteps behind us, and his voice shouting for us to stop. But we didn't stop. We turned one corner, then another, always towards the lights and noise of the main street. When we finally reached a busy area, with other families trick-or-treating, I allowed myself to look back. Mike had disappeared, swallowed by the darkness of the empty streets we left behind. We didn't stop running until we reached the Thompsons' house. I locked the door as soon as we got in and immediately called the police. The children were scared and confused, but unharmed. I explained everything to the police when they arrived, and they started a search of the neighborhood. They discovered that there was no maintenance employee named Mike in the local apartment complex. The abandoned house he had led us to had recently been used by a group of criminals. They never caught Mike, or whoever he really was. To this day, years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, remembering that Halloween. I learned the hard way that not every monster wears a mask, and that sometimes true terror isn't in ghost stories, but in the real people who cross our path. It was October 2019, and I had just turned 16. I lived in Hollow Creek, a small town in eastern Texas, the kind where everyone knows each other and gossips about each other's lives. I was the typical bored teenager, dreaming of escaping to the world beyond our county's borders. That year, the town council had the brilliant idea of recruiting volunteers to help the elderly decorate their homes for Halloween. I thought it would be a good chance to earn a few bucks and maybe score some free treats. Little did I know that this decision would change my life forever. Our team consisted of 5 teenagers: me, Amber, my best friend since kindergarten, the twins Ethan and Emma, and Josh the nerd of the group who knew everything about urban legends and conspiracy theories. On the first day, we met in the town square in front of the old Baptist church to receive instructions from Mr. Thompson, the project coordinator. He was a strange fellow, with bulging eyes and a forced smile that gave me chills. As he explained our tasks, I noticed his hands were shaking non-stop, and he kept nervously glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, as if expecting something to leap out of the bushes dried by the Texan heat at any moment. Our first destination was Mrs. Mabel's house, an old lady in her 80s who lived alone in a Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, she greeted us with a strange, almost mechanical smile. Her eyes seemed glazed, as if she were in a trance. "Welcome, dears," she said in a monotone voice. "The decorations are in the basement. Follow me." I exchanged nervous glances with Amber as we descended the creaky stairs. The air grew heavier with each step, and a strong smell of mold and something I couldn't identify invaded my nostrils. The basement was a labyrinth of dusty boxes and old furniture covered with yellowed cloths. Mrs. Mabel led us to a dark corner where there was a pile of boxes labeled Halloween decorations. When I opened the first box, my heart nearly stopped. Inside were dozens of small rag dolls, each with an eerily realistic face. "These are my babies," Mrs. Mabel whispered, picking up one of the dolls and stroking it as if it were a real child. "They need to be fed every Halloween night." Her voice had a sinister tone that made my hair stand on end. I looked at my friends and saw the same terror in their eyes. Something told me this was only the beginning of a series of disturbing discoveries. I swallowed hard and tried to stay calm as we distributed the creepy dolls around Mrs. Mabel's garden. Josh, ever the curious one, began examining one of the dolls more closely. "Guys," he whispered, "there's something strange here. These faces." They looked like real wax before we could process this information. Mrs. Mabel appeared out of nowhere, snatching the doll from Josh's hands. "Careful, dear," she said with a forced smile. "They are very fragile." Her eyes glimmered in a way that made me want to run away from there. After finishing at Mrs. Mabel's house, we headed to Mr. Jenkins' residence, a reclusive war veteran who lived at the end of the street. The Texan sun was already setting, casting long and distorted shadows across the neighborhood. When we arrived, Mr. Jenkins was in the yard, fiddling with something that looked like a large iron cauldron. "Oh, the young helpers have arrived," he grumbled, not taking his eyes off his work. "You can start hanging those garlands over there." He pointed to a pile of braided ropes in a corner of the yard. As I approached to grab them, my blood ran cold. The garlands were made of bones. Small bones which seemed to be. No, it couldn't be. I looked at Ethan, who was beside me, and saw his face turn pale. Are they real?" He muttered, horrified. "Of course, they're real, kid." Mr. Jenkins replied with a hoarse laugh that sounded more like a growl. "Nothing like the authentic stuff to give that special touch, right?" He winked at us as if sharing an inside joke. My stomach churned. "Emma, always the bravest of us, asked in a trembling voice, 'Mr. Jenkins, where did these bones come from?'" The old veteran narrowed his eyes, his wrinkled face contorting into a sinister smile. "Let's just say Halloween in Hollow Creek has a very special tradition. You'll soon understand." While we were hanging the macabre garlands, I noticed something moving inside Mr. Jenkins' cauldron. The smell emanating from there was nauseating, a mix of rotting flesh and unknown herbs. Suddenly, I heard a muffled scream coming from inside the house. Amber, who was closest to the window, turned pale as a ghost. There's someone in there," she whispered, pointing to a second-floor window. For a moment, I saw a face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with fear. But when I blinked, the vision had vanished. Mr. Jenkins, noticing our agitation, laughed again. "Ah, must be just the wind, kids. This old house is full of strange noises," but the way he said it, with a manic gleam in his eyes, made me certain there was much more going on there than simple, strange noises. We finished the work at Mr. Jenkins' house as quickly as possible, all eager to leave. As we walked away, Josh began piecing things together. "Guys, don't you think something is very wrong here? First Mrs. Mabel's dolls, now these bone garlands." Before he could continue, Rodrigo interrupted him. "And did you notice we didn't see any kids on the streets? In a neighborhood like this, it should be full of kids running around." A shiver ran down my spine. He was right. The silence in the streets was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustling of dry leaves. Our next stop was Dr. Eliza Green's house, a retired doctor living in an imposing mansion in the town center. When we arrived, she greeted us with an artificial smile and eyes as cold as ice. "Ah, the young volunteers. How wonderful to have you here," she said, leading us to the backyard. The yard was a maze of grotesque statues and dry fountains. In the center was a huge, faded circus tent. "This year, I'm doing a Circus of Horrors theme," Dr. Green explained with a disturbing enthusiasm. "Why don't you take a look inside? I'm sure you'll love the surprises I've prepared." Reluctant, but with no choice, we approached the tent entrance. The smell of formaldehyde and something metallic blood intensified with each step. When I parted the curtain and looked inside, my scream caught in my throat. What I saw in there would forever change my perception of Hollow Creek and the true meaning of Halloween. Inside the tent, there were a series of attractions that seemed straight out of a nightmare. Rusty cages contained what, at first glance, appeared to be incredibly realistic wax dolls of deformed and mutant creatures. But as I got closer, I realized with horror that they moved subtly. One of them turned its head in my direction, its eyes pleading for help. Amber let out a muffled scream and grabbed my arm with such force that her nails left marks. They're alive," she whispered, panic evident in her voice. Dr. Green appeared behind us, her smile now revealing sharp, unnaturally white teeth. "Fascinating, aren't they? My little experiments for the big Halloween show, as we tried to process what we were seeing. I heard Josh muttering something about a local urban legend. They say decades ago, a mysterious circus came to town and never left. That the performers blended with the population." His voice trailed off as the realization hit him. Dr. Green laughed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound. "Very perceptive young man. But you haven't seen anything yet. The grand finale is yet to come." She pointed to a curtain at the back of the tent. "Why don't you take a peek at our main act?" With my heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode, I approached the curtain. When I pulled it aside, what I saw there made me question everything I thought I knew about reality and fiction. It was a sight so horrific that my mind refused to fully process it. Behind the curtain, there was a makeshift laboratory. Rusty surgical tables were arranged in a circle, each with a body lying on it. But they weren't ordinary bodies, they were a grotesque mix of human and animal parts, sewn together like a macabre patchwork quilt. On one table, I saw what looked like an adult man's torso connected to a deer's legs. On another, a child's head was attached to the body of a large feline. The smell of decomposition and chemicals was unbearable. Luana fainted beside me, and Ethan barely managed to catch her before she hit the floor. Dr. Green walked calmly among the tables, stroking the creatures as if they were pets. "Beautiful, aren't they?" she asked, her eyes shining with a sick excitement. "Each one is a unique masterpiece. And you, my young friends, will be the next additions to my collection." Her face began to contort, the skin stretching and tearing to reveal something inhuman beneath. I realized with horror that she was no longer entirely human, if she ever had been. We tried to run, but found that the tent entrance had disappeared, replaced by a solid wall. We were trapped. Panic set in as I heard the screams of my friends mingling with the sound of electric saws and surgical instruments being prepared. At that moment, I understood that Halloween in Hollow Creek was much more than a simple celebration. It was a ritual of indescribable horror amid the chaos and terror. Josh shouted something about a symbol he had seen repeatedly in the house decorations, an inverted pentagram with an eye in the center. "It's the cult's symbol," he yelled, trying to make himself heard above the screams and the buzz of the saws. "They do this every year, turning people into monsters." Just then, as if responding to our discovery, we heard a deafening roar from outside the tent. The ground began to shake, and the canvas walls flapped violently. Dr. Green, now fully transformed into a creature that looked like a grotesque mix of woman and spider, let out a maniacal laugh. "The great old one is coming," she screamed in ecstasy, "and you will be the perfect sacrifice." Desperate, we began searching for an exit. Emma, always the most athletic of the group, managed to tear a piece of the canvas with a scalpel she had grabbed from one of the tables. "This way," she shouted, and we scrambled to squeeze through the small opening. We emerged into Dr. Green's backyard, but the horror wasn't over. The sky was blood red, and in the town center, we saw a colossal creature emerging from the ground, an amorphous mass of tentacles, eyes, and mouths, taller than any building. The residents of Hollow Creek, including Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Mabel, and Mr. Jenkins, were in the streets, their bodies twisting and merging with each other as they chanted in an unknown language. I realized with horror that Halloween in Hollow Creek was not just an annual ritual, it was the awakening of something much older and more terrible. With our hearts in our throats, we ran through the chaotic streets of Hollow Creek. The air was heavy with a greenish mist and the smell of sulfur. Everywhere, we saw the residents transforming into hideous creatures, their bodies merging and twisting in impossible ways. Amber stumbled and fell, and when I turned to help her, I saw with horror that her feet were beginning to fuse with the asphalt. "Leave me," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Save yourself." It was the hardest decision of my life, but I knew I couldn't stop. With one last apologetic look, I kept running, Amber's screams echoing in my ears. We reached the town's limits, where the road met the dense pine forest. Josh, panting and pale, pointed to a sign half hidden among the trees. "There," he shouted, "the Circle of Protection." It was an old wooden sign, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly. Without thinking twice, we jumped over the imaginary line drawn by the sign. The instant we crossed, it was as if an invisible bubble enveloped us. The creature's roar and the town's screams suddenly became muffled, as if we were underwater. We looked back, seeing Hollow Creek engulfed in green flames and the tentacled monstrosity rising ever higher in the sky. Exhausted and traumatized, we hugged each other, crying with relief and horror. We had survived, but we knew our lives would never be the same. Halloween in Hollow Creek had revealed a world of nightmares we could never forget, and I was sure that creature, that great old one, would not be satisfied with just our small Texan town. We spent the night in the forest, shivering with cold and fear, unable to sleep with the distant sounds of destruction and chaos coming from the town. When the sun finally rose, we gathered the courage to peek beyond the protection line. Hollow Creek was unrecognizable. Where there had once been houses and streets, now only smoldering ruins and bizarre structures remained, seeming to be made of fused flesh and metal. There was no sign of the giant creature, but the sky still held a sickly hue, like an infected wound. We decided we needed to alert the authorities, but who would believe us? We walked for hours until we reached the neighboring town, where we were met with looks of distrust and incredulity. Our clothes torn and dirty, our haunted expressions, everything screamed trouble. We tried to tell our story to the local police, but we were dismissed as teenagers playing an elaborate Halloween prank. Frustrated and desperate, we agreed to keep secret what we had seen, at least for now. But we made a pact. One day, when we were ready, we would return to Hollow Creek. Not to rescue or save. We knew it was too late for that, but to understand, to try to prevent that horror from spreading. Because deep down, we all felt that what happened in our small Texan town was just the beginning of something much larger and much more terrifying. And while the world continued to turn, oblivious to the nightmare we had witnessed, we carried with us the burden of this dark secret, knowing that the true meaning of Halloween was far beyond the imagination of any normal person. It was Halloween 2019, and for the first time since moving to the United States, I volunteered to be part of our neighborhood's security patrol in Boca Raton, Florida. My name is Eric. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a quiet community near Misner Park with my wife Astrid and our 2 young children. We're originally from Bergen, Norway, and moved here just 6 months ago when I received an offer to work as an engineer at a renewable energy company. Since we arrived, I've been impressed by the strong sense of community in the neighborhood, something quite different from what we were used to in our hometown. That night, I met the other volunteers at the Boca Raton Community Center at PM, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. We were a group of 12 people, and I was clearly the newcomer. Most were unfamiliar faces to me, except for our neighbor Susan, who kindly invited me to participate. As we prepared, I noticed 3 people who seemed as out of place as I did. One of them, A tall, thin man with a slightly crooked smile introduced himself as Ryan. There was something in his eyes that instantly made me uncomfortable, a strange, almost feverish gleam. The other two were a couple, Marcy and Phil, who said they had recently moved to Palmetto Park Road. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, focusing on our mission to keep the children safe during trick-or-treating, a tradition that was still new and fascinating to me and my family. As the sun set and the first costumed children began to appear on the streets, our group split into pairs to cover different areas of the neighborhood. To my surprise, I was assigned to patrol with Ryan, the man with the unsettling gaze. As we walked along streets decorated with lit pumpkins and fake spider webs, I tried to start a casual conversation to ease my tension. "So, Ryan, have you lived around here for long?" I asked, adjusting the reflective vest that identified us as community watchmen. His response was evasive, almost rehearsed. "Oh, you know how it is. Time flies by so fast, we hardly notice." He smiled sideways, his eyes never directly meeting mine. As the night progressed, I noticed that Ryan seemed more interested in observing the houses than the passing children. Several times I caught him making discreet notes in a small notebook he carried in his pocket. When I questioned him about it, he quickly put the notebook away and muttered something about just keeping a record of suspicious activities. But what suspicious activities? Up to that point, all I had seen were happy families and excited children collecting candy. A shiver ran down my spine when I realized that Ryan always seemed to know exactly which houses had absent residents. How could he have that kind of information? I thought, feeling a growing unease. Around p.m., we crossed paths with Marcy and Phil, the couple we had met earlier in the evening. They seemed agitated, engaged in heated whispers that abruptly ceased when we approached. Marcy forced a smile, but her eyes were wide and restless. "Is everything okay around here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Phil answered too quickly. Sure. Everything's great." But something in his tone of voice didn't convince me. I noticed that Phil was carrying a bulky backpack that he didn't have at the beginning of the night. When I questioned him about it, he stammered an explanation about having picked up some extra supplies for the patrol. As we walked away, Ryan leaned in and whispered to me, "They're not who they say they are." His comment caught me by surprise. "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling my heart race. Ryan looked around, as if checking if anyone was listening, and then said in a low voice, "I saw them coming out of a house on Palmetto Park Road. The house was empty, Eric. They went in through the back and came out minutes later." I was shocked by the revelation, but before I could fully process the information, a sharp scream cut through the night, coming from a few blocks away. Without thinking twice, I started running towards the sound. With Ryan right behind me, we ran towards the scream, our footsteps echoing in the now almost deserted streets. Most of the children had already gone home, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the distant sound of barking dogs. As we turned a corner, we came upon a surreal scene. Susan, our neighbor and organizer of the patrol, was standing in the middle of the street with an expression of pure terror on her face. She was frantically pointing at a 2-story house with all the lights off. I saw someone dragging a body inside. She stammered, her voice trembling. My blood ran cold. I looked at Ryan, expecting to see the same surprise and concern I felt, but what I saw alarmed me even more. His face was impassive, almost satisfied. He quickly took out his cell phone and started dialing, saying he was going to call the police. At that moment, I noticed something strange. The notebook he was carrying had fallen to the ground during our run. I bent down to pick it up, and when I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. There was a detailed list of addresses, times, and children's names. The address of the house Susan was pointing to was circled in red. I looked at Ryan, who was now staring at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I was seeing. Ryan's notebook was clear evidence that something very wrong was happening, something that went far beyond a simple neighborhood watch. With my heart pounding in my chest, I tried to stay calm as I returned the notebook to Ryan, pretending I hadn't seen its disturbing contents. "Is the police on their way?" I asked, my voice betraying a slight tremor. Ryan nodded, his eyes never leaving mine, as if he were evaluating me. "Yes, they'll be here in a few minutes," he replied, his voice strangely calm given the situation. At that moment, I heard a noise coming from the dark house. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps upstairs. Susan heard it too, and her face paled even more. "There's someone in there," she whispered, grabbing my arm tightly. I knew we should wait for the police, but something inside me screamed that we didn't have time. The children, the addresses in Ryan's notebook, the suspicious behavior of Marcy and Phil, everything connected in a sinister way that I couldn't ignore. I made a decision that could change everything. "I'm going in," I announced, to Susan's shock and Ryan's enigmatic expression. As I headed for the entrance of the house, I heard Ryan say softly, "You have no idea what you're about to discover, Eric." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I knew there was no turning back. Whatever was happening on this Halloween night, I was about to uncover it. With my heart racing, I approached the front door. It was ajar, a silent and threatening invitation. I cast one last look behind me, seeing Susan biting her lips nervously and Ryan with an enigmatic smile that didn't reach his eyes. I took a deep breath and entered. Darkness immediately engulfed me, and the smell of mold and something else, metallic, invaded my nostrils. I used my cell phone flashlight to illuminate the way, revealing an impeccably tidy living room. Everything seemed normal, except for one disturbing detail. There were drag marks on the carpet, leading to the stairs. Following the marks, I climbed the steps cautiously, each step making the old floorboards creak under my feet. The sound of footsteps upstairs had ceased, but I could feel a presence, as if the house itself was watching me. As I reached the upstairs hallway, I saw a faint light coming from under one of the doors. I approached slowly, sweat trickling down my temples. As I was about to turn the doorknob, I heard muffled voices coming from the other side. I froze. One of the voices was familiar. It was Marcy, the woman I had met earlier in the evening. "We have to hurry," she was saying urgently. "The plan is at risk. That idiot Norwegian is suspecting something." My blood ran cold. They knew about me. And then I heard something that made my heart almost stop. The muffled cry of a child. The child's cry ignited something inside me, a mixture of fear and determination that propelled me to act. Without thinking twice, I pushed the door open forcefully, bursting into the room. The scene that unfolded before my eyes was surreal and terrifying. Marcy and Phil were standing next to a large open suitcase, where a small child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, was gagged and tied up. Around them, scattered on the floor, were documents, fake passports, and an absurd amount of money. Marcy's eyes widened in surprise, while Phil pulled a gun from his waistband. "You shouldn't be here," Phil growled, pointing the gun at me. My mind was racing, searching for a way out. "The police are on their way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You have nowhere to go." Marcy let out a bitter laugh. "You really think the police will stop us? This is bigger than you can imagine, Eric. We have people everywhere." At that moment, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. My heart leaped, thinking it might be help arriving. But when the figure appeared in the doorway, my blood froze. It was Ryan, with that same crooked smile on his face. "Well, well," he said, entering the room. "Looks like our Norwegian friend decided to join the party." The realization hit me like a punch. Ryan wasn't my ally. He was part of all this. Surrounded and with no way out, I realized that this Halloween night was far from over, and that the true horror was just beginning. The tension in the room was palpable. Ryan closed the door behind him, blocking my only escape route. My eyes darted between the three criminals and the child in the suitcase, my brain working frantically to find a way out. "You see, Eric," Ryan began, his voice strangely calm, "this is nothing personal. It's just business." He moved closer to the window, briefly glancing at the street below. "Our enterprise is quite profitable, and unfortunately, you ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Double quotes. At that moment, I heard sirens in the distance. The police were coming. I saw a flash of panic in Marcy and Phil's eyes, but Ryan remained impassive. "Looks like we need to speed things up," he said, pulling a syringe from his pocket. My heart raced when I realized his intentions. In an act of pure desperation and adrenaline, I lunged at Phil, who was still holding the gun. There was a moment of total chaos, screams, the sound of struggle, and then a deafening bang. The gun had gone off. For a second, time seemed to freeze. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder and realized I had been hit. But the shot had an unexpected effect. The sudden noise caused Ryan, Marcy, and Phil to panic. Taking advantage of the confusion, I managed to reach the suitcase and pull it close to me. Shielding the child with my body, the chaos that followed was a confused mixture of screams, quick movements, and pain. My shoulder throbbed intensely, but adrenaline kept me focused. Ryan, Marcy, and Phil were frantically arguing about what to do, their voices overlapping in a pandemonium of accusations and desperate plans. I took advantage of the distraction to try to untie the child's bonds, my trembling fingers struggling against the knots. The little one looked at me with eyes wide with fear, but there was also a spark of hope. The sirens were getting louder, and I could hear the sound of cars braking sharply on the street. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open violently. For a moment of pure terror, I thought they were more accomplices of the group. But to my immense relief, they were heavily armed police officers. "Police! Hands up!" one of them shouted. Ryan tried to jump out the window, but was quickly apprehended. Marcy and Phil, realizing there was no escape, surrendered. As the police handcuffed the criminals, a paramedic rushed to me and the child. "It's all okay now," he said, gently removing the gag from the little one. I looked at the scene before me, still hardly believing what had happened. It was then that I noticed Susan at the door, tears in her eyes, but with a smile of relief. "You did it, Eric," she said softly. "You saved that child." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of statements, medical examinations, and endless questions. Sitting in the ambulance, with my shoulder bandaged and a thermal blanket over my shoulders, I observed the frantic movement of police officers and investigators. The rescued child, whose name I learned was Thomas, was being cared for by social workers, his family already on the way. As a detective questioned me, I learned that Ryan, Marcy, and Phil were part of an international child trafficking network, and that my accidental intervention had helped dismantle an important cell of the organization. Days later, still processing what had happened, I received an unexpected visit. It was Thomas's father, with tears in his eyes and gratitude overflowing in every word. He hugged me tightly, ignoring my injured shoulder, and said that I had saved not only his son, but his entire family. At that moment, all the pain and fear I felt on that Halloween night seemed worth it. I realized that even as a foreigner in this new land, I had made a difference. The experience changed my perspective on Boca Raton, on the United States, and most importantly, on myself. Today, months later, I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, reliving those moments of terror. But then I remember Thomas's smile, safe in his father's arms, and I know I would do it all again if I had to. That Halloween night taught me that sometimes real monsters don't wear masks, and that courage can emerge in the most unexpected moments.